Hello, so I've got some tea leaves here that have been, sorry the light's not great, but they've been saved over the last week, and I've saved another bag full of recycled plastic bag full of tea leaves this week as well, tea bags that have been used, so the tea has plenty of tannin left in it after it's made a cup of tea, made a hot drink. So what's good is to get the tea leaves out of the tea bag, as you've got more surface area of the tea leaves if you do so. To make put them into just a normal saucepan, cover them with hot water like you would a normal tea, and bring it to a boil. And then we're going to simmer it to infuse the leaves with the water to create your pigment. So I'm just going to use this saucepan here, tip them all in. You can't see it, but they're in there. One note on keeping the tea leaves whilst you're saving them. You can try and let them air out. So I didn't actually have the lid on this pot whilst I've been saving up my tea bags. I've just let it sit there. It has grown a tiny bit of mould in the last couple of weeks, but it shouldn't affect the dye pot. So I'm just going to get a kettle and then cover the tea leaves with the water. So no more than what is required to cover the tea leaves, and you want to use like a stainless steel spoon if you have one. And what I'm going to do is just pop that on the boil on the hob, and then we can bring it to a boil and then let it simmer for half an hour. I'm just going to put this onto the boil, which is the tea leaves. I'll bring that up to a boil in a small saucepan. Already I can see the colour in the water just from adding hot water. I'll leave that to boil on there. Tea, obviously you can collect it from your used tea bags. It's black tea that makes the dye. It's a substantive dye, which means that you don't have to add any mordant to it. You don't have to bind it with the fibre. This is now boiling, this tea. I don't know if you can see it there. I'm just going to move it over to the wood burner to let it simmer for half an hour to create the colour in the pigment. We've got onion skins here. It's one of the things you can collect from your kitchen. You only want the dry, papery bits of the onion. It's a really good dye stuff to start with as a beginner dyer or ink maker, because it's easy to collect. It makes a really rich yellow ochre colour, sometimes orange, and you don't have to add anything to it to attach it to the fibre, because it's a substantive dye as well. So there's already natural tannins in the skins, so it will last, and it's colour fast basically. Pop the onion skins onto boil. I'm going to cover with as little amount of hot water as I can with the kettle. Again, using a stainless steel spoon so that it doesn't interfere with the pigment process. And just to use as little water as you can, because it will wilt down a bit. Next I'm going to do an avocado pigment. So I actually collect, you can't see again, but in here I've got avocado stones and skins. I actually collect them in the freezer, because then they start to go mouldy quite quickly otherwise, even if you clean them as thoroughly as you can. So the size of my pan, it being a bit wider, I'm just going to do a shallower a dye bath as possible, and get this on to boil. Again, this is another substantive dye, so it doesn't need a mordant or, you know, something to fix it to the fibre, in our case paper. It's just going to use its natural skin. I'm going to bring this to boil, and as soon as it is, I'll pop it on the wood burner as well for half an hour. I'd really recommend using the wood burner if you've got one. There are other ways also of doing it, such as solar dyeing. You can put a glass jar with your dye stuff and the amount of liquid in it, and leave it in the sun for a week in a sunny place, using no extra energy. And my way of doing that is using a wood burner at the moment, because there's not a lot of sun. Okay, this is now coming to a boil, and I'm just going to dip my spoon in. Already I can see the colour of the water changing, but it's just come to the boil, so I'm going to put it on the wood burner. To strain the pigment that you've made, this is the tea leaves, which shows the most amount of pigment so far, I think. So I've just stirred it with a stainless steel spoon in a stainless steel pot, and because of all of these things are derived from your kitchen, they are fine in your household saucepans. There's very little liquid in here, so it has reduced quite a lot. So this is perfect for ink making, because you don't want a lot of liquid, you want it to be condensed. So after this stage, I'm just going to use muslin here. Well, you can't see. There we go. I'm just spooning it into a bowl, a glass bowl with some muslin put into it. Hopefully you can see this. I'll show you properly in a minute. Spooning it all in to the muslin. You can also use a coffee filter paper if you've got one of those sort of Americano machines. But now you can see it's just sat in its liquid, and I'm just going to lift up the muslin. This is also how you do the coffee grounds. Because they're so fine, the muslin will get rid of the dye stuff and leave you with just a liquid. And it's a lovely colour already. It's obviously quite hot, so it's probably best to leave this a little longer to cool down before doing it. And if you squeeze all of it out rather than thinking, oh, that's enough ink, you'll get all of the tannins and all of the dye stuff. And then what we're going to do next is reduce it down further, so don't worry about the amount of liquid that you have in there. Oh, it looks like a cup of tea, even without any milk, which is quite amazing. And maybe that's perhaps because it's got some milk residue in there. I did get my mum to save me some of these tea bags, but don't worry, it'll make a nice colour. So that's the colour at the moment. I'm now going to put it back into the pan after washing it and boil it down some more. I've left all of the pans without the lids on, and I know it's really dark in here and you can't see the colours, but slowly, especially on the wood burner, and if you don't have one then on the hob will do on a very low heat, they are reducing down. Just keep the lid off, just like you would with a sauce really. So they're just sitting there. It could take a couple of hours to get them to the desired thickness. To add binders to our pigments to make them into inks, so there are a few ways of doing this. You can traditionally add things like gum arabic or shellac, ways of thickening the liquid. Because we're using things from our kitchen, I've got a bit of corn flour, and I've also got some xanthan gum, which you might have for gluten-free cooking. I'm going to start off with 1/8 of a teaspoon. I don't have a measure that small. You've just got to be really careful of how much of each that you use, because otherwise you might find that it's too thick for anything. We are aiming for a watercolour ink here. So I'm going to do 1/2 of a 1/4 teaspoon, which is 1/8. I'm going to use this in the coffee. In all, I might end up adding 1/2 teaspoon. just stirring it in. That's thickened up now. One way of really good way of testing whether your ink is what you want it to be is getting a piece of paper, preferably a watercolour paper, and I'm just going to move you slightly away. Just testing it on the paper, making sure it is watercolour so that it can absorb it properly. So I'm just going to do a nice... So I mean, that to me looks like a lovely ink. It's a good consistency for a watercolour ink. So for that one I have used, it's good to document this as well if you want to, that's coffee, approximately 100ml, and a half a teaspoon of corn flour. I'll show you the colour without it running. It's going to run a little bit, but it would be good to just leave that to dry and do different tests on different binders and different pigments. So that's the coffee with corn flour added. Got a nice brown ink there. Obviously continue to add corn flour or xanthan gum, whichever you're using, until you're happy with your consistency.